Start recording. Okay, so we're recording now. If you guys have questions, just use the chat talk and try to stop it. But this is what Illustrator looks like when we open it up. If you have opened it for the first time, you may see something similar. So with Photoshop, where there's like and you can feel free to click around on those. But this interface is a little bit different. It gives us some kind of like basic different types of presets for different files. And so we could use one of those presets. Illustrator uses some different dimensions. Like you can see it says a letter is 612 by 792 points, which is like a physical graphic design term. That's a unit that's used when you're designing like a poster or an advertisement that's going to be printed um, on a physical piece of paper. But there's also some basic stuff for like a web browser, new iPhone, HD, video, and we can look at some more sets. And this is more similar to what we saw in the Photoshop version. I'm probably just going to do a basic web that I'll do this one. And let's see, I'm going to change the orientation to, so it's going to be 1024 by 12 pixels. This could give me enough room to work on stuff, but not be too. So you can choose a different resolution if you want for what you're working on, but that's a good kind of place to start. And I'm going to use pixels because I am designing something for the web. I'm not going to print this, so I'm not going to go with points or some of these other dimensions here. I'm just going to stick with. Uh, okay, so that's going to open up my default Illustrator interface. You can see it looks pretty similar to what we saw in Photoshop. There's a big white canvas in the middle, which is where we're going to add our shapes and colors. There's a properties panel on the right. And there's a layers panel as well. I'm probably going to separate those out so I can use. There's a comment section, kind of interesting stuff. I don't expand or get rid of it. Oh, it's part of this. Okay, and then I can fit this back. So just like the Photoshop interface, the Illustrator interface is very flexible. I can move things around and change the layout. If I want to put my layers down here, this is kind of like what it used to look like. Get the layers down here, and then the properties. And those are both pretty useful, so I'm going to leave those open. I could also do like what I did in Photoshop, put my layer here. That looks kind of nice as well. Again, whatever you like, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of up to you how you want to workspace. But just keep in mind, you can always go back to workspace and choose one of the workspace and set, and that'll take you back to how it starts off. Build this real quick. And layers are the things that I'm always using, so I'm not too worried about some of the other properties, some other things we might want to add into. We also have a normal toolbar, and there's a few different types of tools here. There's some overlap, but mostly they're kind of different. You can make the toolbar larger if you want. And we're going to go over a lot of these tools, not all of them today, but we'll look at a lot of them. And yeah, then I have my canvas. Same thing where if I hold the space bar, I get a little hand, and that makes it easy to move. If I scroll on my scroll wheel, I'll scroll the canvas up and down. And if I hold control, I'll scroll left and right. So I'm holding control on my keyboard and scrolling with my scroll wheel at the same time. And then if I hit Alt or Option on my keyboard, I can zoom in and out. So those are all really useful ways to manipulate this. You can also choose, there's a zoom tool just like in Photoshop, so I can zoom where I can hold Option out. And so there's a lot of different ways to manipulate on it. If I hit Control plus and minus, it's also going to zoom out. If I hit Control 0, it's going to fit the canvas to the screen. If I hit Control 1, it's going to show 100%. resolution on the screen. So a few different ways to the canvas around. Illustrator also uses layers like Photoshop, and layers are a good way of kind of organizing what we're working with. And so we'll see as we add shapes to the screen or to the canvas what the there's also a few options. I didn't go over this with Photoshop. This exists in Photoshop, but it's a little bit more useful with Illustrator because we're not just going to be working with data that already exists. We're actually going to be creating our own data. And so a useful thing when you're creating your own shapes is to add in a grid. And so if you go to View and show or hide the grid, so that's really useful. And you can change the grid units if you want to. If you go to a little bit different on PC. On Mac, it's probably under like the name of the thing. But if I go to on PC, if I go to Edit, I go to Preferences and go to Units or Guides and Grid, I can change how that grid. And then so if I want to toggle that on and off, I can just hit Control and the quotation mark key, and so I can toggle my grid. And then another thing I can do, which is I find useful, you can turn this on and off as well, is snap to grid. What this does is it's gonna, when you make a shape on the screen, it's gonna kind of make the shape stick to the sides of the grid. So it makes it a little bit easier if you're trying to design something that has a lot of like symmetry and alignment and things like that. So snap to grid is a useful thing to add. So I'm gonna click on snap to grid, and you can turn this on and off with Control Shift, so you don't see anything change. I'm going to turn on my grid, and I'm just going to get started with my self-portrait. I'm going to start by adding some basic shapes. And so my shape tool is right here. The default is the rectangle tool, and so I can switch to that using the M key on the keyboard. Hit M, my tool changes. And if I hold down, you can see there's a few other types of shapes that we can. So let's start with our rectangle. And since I have the grid snapping on, you'll notice that if I get close to one of the edges on the grid, probably hard to see, zoom in a little. Okay, so I'm gonna undo that. So if I get close to one of these edges, it's gonna snap to that edge. And you may find that useful or not. I like using it that way because it makes it a little bit easier to lay out a design. So making the self-portrait, I'm gonna line this up nice and centered. And so once you make that rectangle, you can see it's under the layer. So if I click on this little arrow next to the layer, it shows me that rectangle right there. And I can rename these layers. So this is part of my self-portrait. I'm going to call this like my face. Yes, I don't know. See what happens. And so I can rename the shapes or the layers. And then I can manipulate the shape once I've created it. There's two selection tools. This is where Illustrator can be kind of frustrating to get started. So the outline selection tool is to select entire object. So if I click on that, that also the key command for that is V. If I click on that, I can move my rectangle. And you can see with grid snapping on, my rectangle kind of snaps to these parts of the. Okay, so that's just to move the whole thing. But I can also manipulate the points in my rectangle. So a default rectangle, you can see these little blue registration points in the corners, middle. Those are the points that make up the rectangle. And if I choose the second arrow, which is the direct selection, this is the A key. Now I can actually click on one of these and I can move this point around. So this is where it can be a little bit tricky. I can also select like holding the mouse down and dragging a box over these 2 points. And now look, I'm manipulating the top of I can move. Okay, so depending on what you're trying to do, you need to be kind of careful about how you're doing your selections. Yeah, I actually didn't. So grab this one point and I can drag it around, uh, and or I can go to the main selection tool and then I can. So a couple of other things I can do by default, if I move my mouse to the outside of this rectangle up here, I can rotate around the center of the rectangle. So that's pretty exciting. And then I can also resize different registration. Um, so I can do that as well. And then these little circles in here, if I drag these in, I can make rounded corners of my rectangle. Um, so that looks pretty good. And I can drag that out to get rid of it if I want to. And if I hold shift or control, that doesn't really, but let's put this in the middle somewhere like. A couple other things I can do. There's a lot of different little manipulations I can do. So when I rotate my rectangle, it's going to rotate around this point in the middle. And so notice that when I click it and I'm rotating around the middle, but I don't have to rotate around the middle. There's this little anchor point, center of my rectangle. I can move that. Oops. There might be uh, maybe under here. Let's see if we can find. Okay, let's say so. Okay, okay. I forgot where that is. Let's Google it real quick. Right below the pen tool. Okay, that's a little more advanced. Let's skip that for now. Although the pen tool, yeah, I don't think that's what okay, we'll have to do that. Okay. Okay, so those are all the different ways that we can manipulate our shape. So that's pretty fun, but let's look at how can we change the colors of the shape, because that's another thing that we're Illustrator. And so we can see over here on the properties panel, there's a couple different options here. It's kind of small. Let me see. Is uh, their interface. Uh, uh, okay, so I have to restart Illustrator. Uh, this. Sorry about that. It's and didn't save my. There we are. Okay. So hopefully it'll save my setup. Okay. So this is a little bit easier to see. Let's turn the grid on. Grab my rectangle. Draw a new rectangle. I didn't have snapping on, so I'm going to hit Control Shift, quotation mark, turn snapping on. Now I'll have a nice thin rectangle. This up here. Okay, and we can bring it in. Anyway, so we have a rectangle. So over here in the properties panel, you can see there's some different properties under appearance that change the color of shape. So first one is the fill. That's the inside of the shape. I have some different options here. I can just click on one of these colors that they suggest. I can choose patterns. I can make my own patterns. It's a little advanced, but there's some default patterns. And I can also click on the color mixer and just design my own color, saying red, green, and so I can find a color that I like here, or I can color picker down here. So there's a couple different ways I can add colors. So let's choose a nice color. Purple or pink is pretty good. So that's the inside. That's the fill of the shape. Um, the other thing I can change is the stroke. So if I click on this stroke value, I can choose a color here. So that would go full or not. Okay. And then we can't really see that very well because the stroke is very skinny. If I zoom in, you might be. But if I click on the shape again, I can change the weight of it. So the more I increase the stroke, notice that that outside shape gets bigger. I can also turn the stroke off. So if I go over here and I just click this like cross, it gets rid of the stroke completely. Same thing with the fill, although if I don't have a stroke or a fill, I don't really have color. And then I can also change the opacity of my shape. So I can get slightly see-through or completely see. Um, so those are kind of the main things I can do. I can also add some effects here. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that we can change here, but I'm going to skip that for now. So there are a bunch of effects you can add, like noise or distortions and things like that to make the color a little bit more interesting. But we're going to stick with this. Okay, so let's say this is going to be like I don't know what part of my self-portrait is. It'll be like my head, I guess. So let's put some eyes on here. So let's choose another shape. So I'm going to click on this box again, but now I'm going to hold it down. And if I want to make some eyes, I want to use an ellipse. Ellipse is like a circle, except it doesn't necessarily have the same width and height. So if I drag this out, you'll see I have a circle. If I hold shift, it's going to make it. So if I want to have a circle, I can do that. And then if I hold shift, it's going to make sure that I keep that same. So let's like put an eye over here. And then if I want to duplicate this shape, I can hold Option. Notice when I hold Option over the shape, my arrow changes into two little arrows. So I can grab this circle and make it here. Maybe I'll make like a little bit of like a robot character. And then for the eyes, if I want to add a that, that looks kind of cool. And I can just hit delete to delete that shape, and then Alt Option again, and copy here. Okay, so now I have some eyes. Maybe I can make some or something. Uh, so so yeah, that's my circle. And it has all the same properties. If I click on this, I can, oh, actually, that's a cool thing. Forgot about that. So I can resize the circle, I can squish it, I can move around, but I can also take my direct selection tool, just grab one of these points, and all of a sudden I can do lots of creative. So once I start moving this point around, you're going to see little blue things called handles. And handles let me change the curvature of the circle. So those are using Bezier curves. A little bit hard to explain the math, but you can play around with those and get a sense. So I can change these location and the general curve of I don't want to do that quite yet because I want my eyes to kind of in this place. Um, but yeah, so you can do direct selections to your shapes as well. If I wanted to make my eyes like a little, maybe if I want to make pointing this side, that might be kind of fun. Drag these out. So again, you can select the whole thing with the direct selection, or you can select individual points with, uh, or sorry, this is direct selection. Other one, okay. So let's add in, so that's a circle. I click on here, I can also add polygons. Polygons are kind of nice because they can have lots of different qualities. So when I make a polygon, let's make this like, let's put this inside the eye. It'll be like eyelid, but it's going to be weird square. So I'm going to change the fill to black, and let's get rid of I'm just kind of doing random stuff right now, so sometimes it's good to have a plan. I'm just kind of like trying. But anyway, once I've got my polygon created, if I use the selection tool, I can move the polygon around, but notice there's a little extra dot right here. And when I hover over it, it's a plus or minus. And that's the different number of sides. So I can change how many sides there are in my. So if I want more sides, I can add sides. If I want less, I can go down to 3 sides, which is obviously just a triangle or a square. Let's go with 5. That's kind of cool. And then I can also make my little rounded corners here. But if I go too far, then I just have a circle. And then I can also rotate it around. Oh, so I accidentally selecting both. Let's move this over here. So that'll be pupil, and then I'll hold Option, grab that here, and add this in, and maybe I'll rotate it around to add a little bit of variety there. Although I kind of rotated it. Okay, that's kind of fun. Whoops. Okay, I hit Control S to save. But that's actually we should be saving as we're working. So I'm going to hit Control S again to save. And it's trying to get me to save to the Creative Cloud. You can do that if you want, but what I'm going to do is click on my computer because that's where I would prefer to save it. And it's still trying to get me to save to the cloud, but and so I'm going to go to my desktop and find my, and I'm going to make a new folder for Illustrator. So I'm going to say Illustrate Self-Portrait, and I'm going to click here, and I'm just going to save this as self-portrait.ai. So AI is like the PE file type, except for Illustrator. So this is self, and it's going to ask me some crap, and I'm just going to say, okay, so I'm going to save this. Notice we still just have one layer, but it has all these different shapes in it. So again, you don't have to do this, but if you like organizing things, I can go in here and organize my shapes a little bit better. So I can click on this, and there's a little button over here. And if you click on that button, it's going to select. So if I click on the layer, I can select all of my shapes in that layer at once. Kind of nice if I want to move. But if I click on an individual part of my layer, it's just going to grab that one shape. That's useful as well. So I'm going to rename this. This is my right. Okay, and there's also an eyeball to turn this on and off, and then there's a lock. If I want to lock this one in place, I can't, and I can lock my whole layer well once I want to prevent. So then I have my left. This one is the left eye and right eye, and this is okay. I can also move the order of these things. So if I move the face up there, you can see it goes in front of the eyes. That's not really what I want, so I'm going to go back down here. If I want the pupil and the eyes to be next to each other, I can do that, but then they come up, so that doesn't really work. But I can change the order, just like Photoshop, whatever is highest in the order is what we're going to see on top. So if I move it, it becomes invisible. If I move it back up, now we see it. let's move. Let's going with our shape. So that was the polygon. Also have a star tool. This is just for creating stars. I'm not sure how useful this is, but maybe I can just have stars sticking around. I don't know if this really fits, so I'm just going to delete this. But the next one I want to go to is the line segment tool. So this is just a way to create lines. So let's say I want to have some teeth. I can create a line and here, and then I guess I can't. I create another line. I guess I just make lines like that's not that exciting. Okay, so we might move on from this, but I could create a line across. Maybe I'll just create one line across, and then I'll use it to make. Okay, so that's my line tool. The line only has a stroke, so that makes sense because it's. Let's call this. Okay, so if I add a fill to the line, you don't see anything change because it's just a line. It only has a stroke. Um, and so if I go in here, I can move, again, I can use the direct selection tool, elements of this line, but that's not that exciting. And I can, the selection tool in general to move around, and of course I can rotate. Okay, so what if we want to make something a little more interesting? That is when our pen tool is going to come in handy. Uh, so I'm going to grab the pen tool. And there are actually two different pen tools. But the pen tool is for making straight lines. Essentially, you can add curves to them once you've created them, but the default is straight. And then the curvature tool adds a curved line by default. So the pen tool is really like the main tool of Illustrator. It's what you would do in. But what I can do with it is I can actually add to my line or connect to other parts of my. So I can make a new line like this, and I can just keep clicking and create a little shape like that. So that's pretty cool. But I can also add to whatever I got. So notice when I hover the pen tool over an already existing shape, I can edit my other shape. So when I do this, you see it turns into a little uh, it turns into a little different icon. And if I click on it, it connects to my mouth shape. And so I'm actually adding to this line now, which is why we now have this fill. I have like a little shape. So let's turn the fill. And so now I can just use my pen tool to kind of draw whatever I want. So I'm going to draw some weird looking here. And I'll probably add a white finish off. And then I'm just going to connect. So then if I get to the next dot, I can connect this, and now I've created a full path. So that's pretty cool. Let's refine this a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in on here. So again, if I go back to my selection tool, I can move of this path into. I can also round these corners. Want to. I can also change. I might not want this little edge here. If I click on that, I can change the corner. Right, that's the same. How do I change the? I can make it rounded, but that's not exactly what. There's a way to make this flat, but I don't. Uh, okay, whatever, that's fine. What I can do is add another point. So with my pen tool, you'll see if I move the pen around, it turns into a minus sign. I can just get rid of a point like that if I hover over a point. But if I hover over an area that doesn't have anything, I can add a point. So if I plus here, that adds a point. And then I need to switch to my selection tool. So then I have to go back to my pen tool, hit P. And when it's an asterisk, that means it could be doing multiple things. So let's see, if I hit control, it's going to do a curve. or sorry, that's Alt Option. If I hit Scroll, that's just a selection. So let's see, if I click here, adds this other point. So I want to do, how do I make it do it? Okay, so maybe I have to move here and there. Now it'll let me. Okay. So once you start manipulating your shape like this, it's really useful to use for pen and A for selection to move in between. Okay, so now I have this like cool mouth shape. I'm going to set the fill to white so it kind of looks like, and I'm going to turn the stroke down a little bit, just a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of fun. Um, so those are kind of like the main different tools that you're going to use to create illustrations, the shape tools, and then the pen tool. I'm going to do a little bit more stuff with the pen tool later, but for now we're going to kind of move on a second. One last tool that I'm going to show you guys that's really useful before we move on is the combine or the shape builder tool to combine different shapes. So let's say I wanted the background and the mouth to be part of the same thing. I can go to my shape builder tool, click on it, and uh, it brings up, so it brings up this like little weird inner. So let me demonstrate this with two shapes. So let's say I want to make like a shape that doesn't exist um, as a default. So I'll click on my line tool and I'll make an ellipse. And let's say I wanted to make a crescent. There's no like default crescent. So what I could do is make another ellipse and overlap them a little bit. And then I can go to my shape builder tool and I can select, or I have to select first. Sorry, I'll go to my selection tool, select both of these shapes, then go to the shape builder tool. Now I can pick out these different shapes and it'll make them into new shapes for me. So now I have each one of these little individual shapes. So the shape builder tool is really useful for creating shapes that don't quite exist, can overlap some shapes and then make new. So I have this little crescent. Let's make this like the like maybe kind of bluish. Kind of nice. So let's go back over here. I'm going to select my mouth and my face, and then I can go to Shape Builder, and so I can pick out any one of these. I want to combine them too, so let's draw through. Okay, that just made, that's not really useful. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's undo that. So now if I hide the mouth, uh, okay, if I move this, there we go. Now I've got this like kind of silhouettes, kind of cool. I lost the color, so let's go to my color palette. Um, I'm just going to use the color picker. That's over here. Pick the color. There we go. And then I'm going to turn here. Or no, actually, let's leave the stroke on. Kind of makes more sense. Okay. So now I have this like one shape that has all the data that I had before with a bunch of shapes. I can delete the other guy. So that looks kind of fun. If I want to make like a cutout, that's an easy. Okay. I think that's enough to go over for now for you guys to get started. Um, so next time we'll go over like saving files and we'll go over a couple different tools. For now, we can just focus on creating basic shapes and then editing those shapes. So you can start by making shapes with the shape tool. You can edit the shapes using the pen tool, and then you can bind the shapes using. So you can actually do quite a lot with just those basic tools. There's a few other things that we'll go over, but I think that is a good starting Illustrator, in my opinion, is a little bit more of a learning curve than Photoshop because of the two different sections. You really have to get used to selecting the shape versus selecting the point. But hopefully that makes sense. I'll give you guys some time to just kind of play around with it and figure it out on your own. And yeah, for this project, we're just making a second self-portrait that will, have both of the images side by side. So again, the Illustrator is a little bit easier to make drawings, so I'm kind of like making this drawing that it doesn't actually look like me, but it looks like a person sort of, or a robot or whatever. But again, it doesn't have to be realistic or representational. If you're interested in drawing something else, like some trees or some animal or uh, anything else that you want to draw is fine. The self-portrait is a starting off prompt, just to give you somewhere to start if you don't have an idea. But if you have a different idea of something that you want to do, all right. So I'm going to stop this recording.